Hi, Emily here from Homemade Emily Jane. Welcome back to the Beaming Quilt class. We are now on lesson 4, where together we are going to make our Scrappy Hourglass units for our Beaming Quilts. So I'm very excited to walk you through this week of our sew along class. If you joined me last week, we made all of our flying geese. So I am very excited to tell you that that was probably the most sewing that we'll have to do in a single week. So if you're feeling a little bit behind, have no fear. This week you'll probably be able to play your catch up and get back on track. So for our flying geese, we had to make 4 flying geese per block on our quilt. So for me, I made 80 flying geese. For our Scrappy Hourglass units, which we're making this week, we only have to make 1 per block on our quilt. So that'll be 20 Scrappy Hourglass units if you're making the throw size quilt like I am. You'll make 9 if you're making the baby quilt, or 42 if you're making the bed size quilt. As always, we'll start off the class by opening your pattern and reading through the section about how to make your hourglass units. There are, of course, 2 different ways to make them. The first off, using your 7.5 inch star color squares. These will be then cut on the diagonal, which I'll show you how I do that. The other option is maybe you already cut out your quarter square triangles using your AccuQuilt. If you have your AccuQuilt pieces, you won't need to cut on the diagonal like we're doing with the squares, because they're already cut out for you to the exact perfect size. So whichever way you choose, I'll be walking you through here on this week's lesson. Feel free to use the chapters listed right here below if you need to fast forward to a particular section of this video. So we'll go ahead and get started. I have a bunch of these 7.5 inch star color squares. So mine are all different shades of pink. They're a lot of fun. The first thing that we'll do is cut them all on both diagonals. So I'm actually going to cut a few layers at a time, and I'll walk you through that process right now. So now I'll go ahead and grab my squares, and I think I'll probably cut, let me see, up to 6 layers at a time. That's kind of a lot, but I'm feeling like I've got a nice sharp blade on my rotary cutter, so I'm feeling good about it. And then I'll go ahead and line up a straight ruler from one diagonal to the other. And you'll see we're going to do this twice. So press down with one hand and then cut with the other. And now, without moving your pieces, you might need to move your ruler. We'll go ahead and line it up on the other diagonal. And you'll see we now have a bunch of different triangles, and these will be mixed and matched and sewn together. But before I do that, I'll go ahead and cut up my entire stack of squares. If you are cutting multiple layers at a time, just make sure that you line them up as close as possible to the edges. It doesn't have to be 100% perfect, because we are going to end up trimming down to size once we sew the triangles together. So for now, just do your best with getting them as accurate as possible. And now we have all of our triangles cut out and neatly stacked together. Now, this is the part where we actually start thinking about the layout of our quilt. I know it seems a little premature, but you'll see that the order in which we sew our triangles together is going to have a big impact on the final layout of the quilt. For me, it won't make as much of a difference because I'm just using all different shades of pink. The method I choose to use is going to be as random as possible. However, I want to walk you through some other options too. You'll see in the green and blue quilt behind me that each Scrappy Hourglass unit actually has 2 blue pieces and 2 green pieces, and they're actually on opposite sides. So I did that throughout the entire quilt, and I rotated the blocks. So you'll see here I have 2 blue triangles pointing together and 2 green triangles pointing together, and in the block above it I have the same thing, but the whole unit is just rotated 90 degrees. So that's one option if you're using the green and blue quilt kit, or a bundle that has 5 of one main color and 5 of another main color. That's a great way to mix them up and make sure that they're spread out throughout the quilt. Another method that I chose to do for the red, white, and blue beaming quilt, I actually have that quilt right here. You'll see I did half of the blocks using all red fabrics and half of the blocks using all blue fabrics. And then I just mixed up, I did the blocks alternating throughout the quilt. So that's another option too. If you're using fabrics that have half of one color and half of another color, you could definitely follow that as well. You would just make sure that your Scrappy Hourglass units are laid out properly for the design that you're going for. I've also seen some really cool options over on Instagram. If you want to check out how other people might be working on theirs, check out hashtag BeamingSAL. Beaming SAL. That is where you can see everyone else's progress. And there was this one that I saw. A particular quilter is doing the bed size, I believe, and it's going to be an ombre layout from one corner to the next. So she chose to use her design wall to lay them all out, and is very intentional about where each piece goes. So if you want to do something really cool like that, I would love to see it, and that's an option as well. But I wanted to make sure that we covered that before we start sewing these triangles together, because the next step is to start laying them out in the way that we want to go into our actual quilt. So you're going to lay them out. You can see here in the pattern, step number 3, or step number 2, we're going to mix and match and lay them out to point towards each other. So really whatever colors you want to go next to each other, you can. I personally am going to make mine as random as possible. So I'm just picking 4 random colors. I personally would recommend that you don't do any of the same color in the same block. But of course, that's all personal preference. So do it however you want to do it, and I'll show you how I've got mine. So you'll see I've got this big stack of fabrics to choose from, and I just randomly selected 4 of my pink triangles, and I can sew them together in sections. So I'll start off by, actually I think I'm going to rearrange some of these. So this one I have 2 solids and 2 prints. So I think what I might actually do is rearrange it so that I have 2 solids pointing towards each other and 2 prints pointing towards each other. That's not going to work out throughout my entire stack because I don't have half and half, but I definitely have fewer solids than prints. So that's just what I'm going to do now. I might end up switching it up later on, but of course that's fine too. So what I'll do next is actually pull these apart, and we're going to sew the top to the side along this seam. So right sides together, and then I'll go ahead and grab my pin. And I always like to pin pointing towards the seam that I'm sewing so that I don't somehow get lost between here and my sewing machine. So then I'll do the same process here. I'll point them right sides together and drop a pin right pointing towards the seam that I want to sew. I'll layer these on top of each other, and I can bring these over to my sewing machine. If you like to chain sew, you could go ahead and do your layout for all of them, pinning them in place, and then bringing them to your machine. Or if you want it to be completely random, you could literally just bring this whole stack directly to your machine and pick the layout as you start sewing. So that's a great option as well. So now you'll see I have just those 2 sets that we originally pinned, and I'll go ahead and just start sewing them with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You'll see I have my leader behind my needle already stitched on, so that's holding my thread back for me. And then I'm going to use the 1/4 inch guide on my foot. Now, one of the reasons I always pin pointing towards the edge I'm sewing is that I actually can keep the pin at least a 1/4 inch away from the edge, and I don't actually have to take it out because I don't sew over it. So you can see I never actually sewed over that pin, but I do have to take the pin out anyway. So it's personal preference if you want to keep the pin in or take it out as you're sewing. So here's another one. Go ahead and line it up. And then when you get to the end, go ahead and stitch on that ender. And then we can snip apart our pieces. You'll see we have our studio dog joining us today. He loves to lounge right wherever I need to stand. Now we have both of our pieces. The first thing I'll do is go ahead and press them with my nice hot iron to set the seams. And then we'll go ahead and lay them out in the direction that they're going to be on the quilt. You'll see we've got the 2 prints and the 2 solids. And this is a fun opportunity to nest your seams. If you've never nested your seams before, that just means that we're going to press one in one direction and the other in the opposite direction. So I'll go ahead and press these here to the side. So for this one, I'm just going to press to the side, and then I'm going to press to the opposite side on the other unit. And this is a really neat way to save time, because pressing to the side is a little easier than pressing open. And when we go to match these up, it'll be a great way to make sure that we get nice crisp points in the center of our block. So now I'll go ahead and put these right sides together, and to nest the seam here, we scooch these together so that those seams like kiss each other. They snuggle up real close, and I'll put a pin in there. So we'll go ahead and just grab your pin and put it directly into the seam allowance, and we'll see that we have those nicely nested. And then I like to add a few extra pins along the corners as well. So the next step is just to sew a 1/4 inch seam on that to finish out our square. And now you'll see that when we open this up, we have our Scrappy Hourglass unit. I'll go ahead and press that final seam open. And now if you want to make sure that your block is nice and flat and crisp, I'll spray a little Best Pretz over all of the seams, especially because they're all on the bias diagonal. And then I'll press it one more time to get everything nice and flat. I do want to take a moment here while I press to mention that you don't have to nest your seams if you don't want to. I personally prefer pressing most of my seams open. So the nesting is a fun way to make sure that this center point is nice and crisp, but it's completely optional as well. Pressing open will give you more flat seams, especially at these points that get sewn together with the flying geese. So just an option and a little bit of personal preference there. Maybe you'll try it out both ways and see which way you like best. So now that we have our hourglass unit all pieced and pressed flat, the final step is to trim it to 6.5 inches square. So I'm going to grab just any ruler, a nice square ruler that's at least 6.5 inches. We're going to line up this one diagonal and also find the halfway point. So half of 6.5 is 3 1/4. So I'm going to line that 3 1/4 dot with the center point of my block. That way we know that we're exactly centered. And then I'll go ahead and trim on 2 sides. And then I'll rotate the entire block and line it back up again. 6.5 inches square, diagonal line. And then this one should be real easy. That point at 3 1/4 should already be lined up. And then we'll trim. And it's as easy as that. Now I'm also going to do it using my AccuQuilt pieces. You'll see here I've got my AccuQuilt triangles already. The only main difference is that AccuQuilt, you need to sew it very precisely. However, I will say that we don't have to trim at the end. So that's kind of the pro here. We'll go ahead and grab our pins and pin these in place. So I'll start off by putting these two together, right sides together, and then putting a pin and then again on this side here. Now, same process here. We'll just go ahead and start stitching. Make sure that you have your leader behind you. It'll make sure that your little corners don't get sucked into your machine. And then the other piece too. And next we'll press them. Just like we did on the other way, go ahead and set your seams with your hot iron and then lay them out so that we can see what our block will look like. So our long edges together, and then you can press to the side, or of course you can press open here, whichever method you like best. I'm going to press these in one direction and then press the other side in the opposite direction. Next, we will grab our pins and start to nest our seams, right sides together. Make sure we pull those seams up nice and close to each other, and then put a pin in that seam allowance, and then a pin at each side. You should see that these corners line up perfectly, and that's what we're looking for here on both sides. And now we can sew that final seam. And just like we did before, lining it up and stitching. When you get close to the seam, you might need to make sure that your seam makes it through nice and flat underneath your presser foot. And then, of course, we're ready to press. Just like we do every time, we'll go ahead and set our seam. And then we will press this final seam open. And then if you wanted to, you can also give this one a nice little bit of best press. Just a little spray on those diagonal seams. Let it soak in. And then we'll press it nice and flat. Be careful here not to distort the fabric. We don't trim these blocks because they're already the accurate size. So we want to be a little bit more careful when we're pressing. And now you can see whether you used your AccuQuilt pieces or your 7.5 inch squares. We have our perfectly 6.5 inch square hourglass units. So make the same number as the number of blocks in your quilt. For me, it'll be 20 of these units, and then I'll see you back here next week where we combine our flying geese, our hourglass units, and some background squares to make our beaming star blocks. I can't wait. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions this week. I'm always happy and I'm here for you. Happy sewing!